The UFC cut a fighter this good? Let me hit you with some facts. Jake Shields went on a 15-fight win streak, beat multiple future UFC champions, and held belts in multiple major organizations. And what did the UFC do? They cut him while he was still ranked in the top 15. That's right, they fired one of the most accomplished fighters in the division while he was still winning fights. So what the hell happened? Was it his grinding, suffocating grappling style? Was it because the UFC was shifting towards an entertainment-first business model? Or did Shields commit the ultimate sin in MMA? Winning fights, but not winning fans. Today we're going to break down the entire story, from his dominance outside of the UFC, to his title shot against Georges St-Pierre, to his mysterious fall from grace. We are diving into the real reason the UFC decided that they didn't need Jake Shields, because they might have made a huge mistake. Shields grew up a country kid, outdoorsy, athletic, and always down for a challenge, and that is exactly what led him to wrestling. Once he found grappling, he was hooked. He wrestled throughout high school and college, but he wasn't just some regular wrestler. He was a savage competitor, winning multiple All-American honors and developing a pressure-heavy control-based style that would later define his entire MMA career. But wrestling wasn't enough. After college, Shields didn't just want to stop competing, he wanted to fight.
My first fight actually was I went to a show to watch with like Chuck and stuff. Someone didn't show up and they're like, anyone want to fight in the crowd? And I'm just like, yeah, sure. and then they picked me.
Was that your first fight?
Yeah. And then when they picked me, the panic set in. I'm just like, oh shit, I didn't think they were going to pick me. And then in the back, they're wrapping my hands. And then I think Chuck's there, these guys. I'm like, well, I can't fail this. I went out there and just destroyed the guy. He wasn't that good, luckily. And then just absolutely hooked after that.
After his first fight, he ended up meeting the perfect coach for his personality, the legendary Cesar Gracie. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it is because Cesar Gracie's gym produced some of the most hardcore, no-nonsense fighters in the sport. We're talking Nick Diaz and Nate Diaz. Yeah, those are Shields' teammates. From day one, Shields trained with a group of absolute maniacs. While most MMA gyms focused on technique and structure, the Cesar Gracie camp was all about grit, toughness, and a warrior mindset. They weren't there to play around. They were there to break you, and that fit Jake Shields perfectly. He wasn't the flashiest, he wasn't the fastest, but he was one of the toughest dudes on the mat. He took that wrestling base, mixed it with jiu-jitsu, and developed a style that was pure pressure. Once he got you on the ground, you weren't getting back up. But how this dominant style would later become both his greatest strength and his ultimate downfall in the UFC is a story that will change how you see the fight business forever. When Shields started his MMA career, it didn't take long for people to realize. This dude was a nightmare matchup for pretty much everyone. Most guys were either grapplers or strikers, but Shields had elite wrestling, suffocating top control, and slick submission skills. He made good strikers look clueless on the ground. He made good grapplers feel like they were drowning. Nobody had an answer for him. From 2005 to 2010, he went on a 15-fight win streak, beating future UFC champions and top contenders. He beat Carlos Condit, one of the most dangerous guys in the sport. He submitted Robbie Lawler, who would later become a UFC welterweight champion. He out-grappled Dan Henderson, a legend with nuclear power in his hands. And that is when the UFC finally came calling.
Right away, I started fighting like the best dudes. So I have so many, but a couple I can throw out is GSP. Everyone knows that guy is like one of the best to ever do it. Dan Henderson was a hard one because he floored me twice in the first round, and I was able to come back after almost getting knocked out and win.
Nice.
I was literally seeing two Dan Hendersons.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what was that like?
But I was prepared to die that night, So I was just like, keep fighting. Even though I was about out, I was able to come back. It felt good to get dropped that hard and then come back and dominate,
Wow.
So
Shields was a world champion, a proven winner, and had the skills to be a problem in the UFC's welterweight division. Everything was lined up perfectly, or so we thought, because once Shields entered the UFC, things did not go as planned. And at first, it seemed like the UFC was all in on him. I mean, why wouldn't they be? The dude was on a 15-fight win streak, held multiple world titles, and had just out-grappled Dan frickin' Henderson. Now, if that's not UFC championship material, I don't know what is. So when the UFC signed him, they immediately put him in a high-profile fight at UFC 121 against Martin Kampmann. But from the moment the fight started, something felt off. Now, Martin Kampmann was not some scrub. Dude was a legit striker with solid wrestling, and he could mix it up really well. But let's be real, Shields was brought in as the favorite. The UFC expected him to make a statement, prove that he belonged, and set up a huge fight against Georges St-Pierre. At least that's how it was supposed to go. Instead, we got a very weird, very shaky performance from Shields. Right away, you could tell that something just wasn't clicking. His wrestling didn't look as sharp. His cardio wasn't there. He was getting outstruck in the exchanges. After one point, he even got caught in a guillotine, which, for a guy that is known for his grappling, was not a good look. And the worst part, Shields' brutal weight cut nearly derailed his UFC debut, one of the biggest moments of his career. Now, to be fair, there was a reason for this. Before signing with the UFC, Shields had been fighting at middleweight, 185 pounds. But when he dropped back down to welterweight, 170 pounds, it completely drained him. After the fight, he had admitted he had cut 20 pounds in a single day just to make weight. Now that is insane. So even though Shields won the fight by split decision, it didn't really feel like a win. It felt like a red flag. And UFC fans weren't sold. Instead of thinking, oh man, this guy's gonna be a problem for GSP, a lot of people were like, wait, this is the dude that they're hyping up? But regardless of how he looked, a win is a win, and Shields had done enough to earn a title shot against Georges St-Pierre. So here we go. The moment Jake Shields had been waiting for, a chance to fight for UFC gold. Now let's set the stage. April 30th, 2011, UFC 129 in Toronto, Canada. 55,000 fans in attendance, the biggest crowd in UFC history at that time. And in the main event was Jake Shields versus Georges St-Pierre for the UFC Welterweight Championship. This was massive. Shields had spent his whole career working for this shot. He had beaten future champions, he had dominated top contenders, and now he was one fight away from becoming the best welterweight on the planet. But there was just one small problem. He was fighting GSP. And GSP in 2011 was peak GSP. The dude had out-wrestled wrestlers, outstruck strikers, and out-game-planned literally everyone in the division. So, could Shields really pull it off? Well, not exactly. Here's the thing. On paper, Shields had a realistic path to victory. If he could get GSP to the ground, he had the elite grappling to control him. If he could wear him down over 5 rounds, he could potentially pull off an upset. But the problem is, GSP isn't just any fighter. GSP is one of the smartest, most well-prepared fighters in MMA history. And from the moment the fight started, it was clear GSP had the perfect game plan. He kept the fight standing. He used his jab like a weapon. He never let Shields get close enough to shoot for a takedown. Basically, GSP turned the fight into a kickboxing match, and that was the worst-case scenario for Shields. The reality was undeniable. Shields' striking simply didn't measure up. Like, at all. His punches were awkward, his movement was stiff, and his striking looked like he was fighting underwater. So for 5 rounds, GSP just picked him apart from the outside. But here's the craziest part. Even though Shields was losing, he was still having moments. In fact, he actually did something that nobody else had done to GSP in years. He busted him up.
Even though I lost it, that's still one of my more memorable fights because GSP's a guy I admired for years. I'd always wanted to fight him. That fight was absolutely insane. I've been to hundreds of fights. That's like the top 2 or 3 most hyped fights I've ever been to. It was at a 60,000 seat arena, completely sold out. That was the largest attendance ever for a fight at the time. GSP's good, man. He's hard to read. He's hard to find. Usually punches don't hurt that bad, but I remember just walking into his first jab. That jab GSP has is world class. It ended up being a close fight. I lost the first 3 rounds and then won the last 2. So part of me is like, could I have pushed?
In a moment that stands out in GSP's entire championship run, Shields landed a jab that severely damaged St. Pierre's eye, forcing the champion to fight half-blind for multiple rounds. This was something no other challenger had managed to do to the seemingly untouchable GSP. Now, did it change the fight? Not really. GSP still won by unanimous decision, and Shields never really threatened to finish him. But the fact that Shields even gave GSP a competitive fight was kind of impressive. But unfortunately, nobody cared. The fight itself was boring as hell. And for the UFC, that was a problem. Because remember, this wasn't just some random fight night. This was UFC 129, a massive stadium show with 55,000 fans watching. The UFC wanted a memorable, explosive fight. Instead, they got a 5-round decision that nobody ever talks about. So even though Shields had just gone toe-to-toe with one of the greatest fighters of all time, the UFC's reaction was basically, cool, but can we get someone more exciting in here? And just like that, Shields' stock took a hit. Not because he lost, plenty of people lost to GSP, but because he didn't lose in an exciting way. And that is when the real problem started. But what came next would reveal the uncomfortable truth about what the UFC really values in its fighters. Because instead of coming out of that fight as a star, he came out as, well, kind of an afterthought. And this was the beginning of a big problem. A problem that would eventually get him kicked out of the UFC, despite still being one of the best fighters in the world. See, Jake Shields was winning fights, but he was winning the wrong way. You see, if you are an MMA purist, you might appreciate things like high-level grappling exchanges, elite position control, and watching a fighter who completely nullifies their opponent's game. And if that's you, well, you probably love watching guys like Khabib, Islam Makhachev, Damian Maia, or even a prime GSP. But the average UFC fan, well, they're wired differently. They don't care about positional dominance or subtle technique. They want big knockouts, crazy scrambles, and wild back-and-forth brawls. They don't want to see a guy take someone down and control them for 15 minutes, even if it is a technical masterclass. And Jake Shields was one of the best grapplers in MMA, but he wasn't exciting about it. His fights didn't have the vicious ground and pound of Khabib. They didn't have the slick submissions of a guy like Charles Oliveira, and they definitely didn't have the explosive moments that make a fight go viral. Shields' game was all about slowly wearing opponents down, suffocating them with control, and draining the fight out of them. And for hardcore fans, that is really impressive. But for Dana White and the UFC, that was a problem. Because the UFC wasn't just about finding the best fighters. They wanted the most exciting fighters. So after the GSP fight, Shields still had a shot to stay in the title picture. All he had to do was beat Jake Ellenberger in his next fight. And let's be honest, if Shields could get Ellenberger to the ground, he probably would have dominated him. But there was one major problem. Shields wasn't mentally there. Just a couple of weeks before the fight, Shields' father and longtime manager Jack Shields passed away. Now, for most fighters, their coach is just their coach. But for Shields, his father was everything. He wasn't just the guy who helped negotiate his contract. He was the guy who had been there since day one. He was the one driving him to tournaments, pushing him through grueling training camps, believing in him when nobody else did. Losing him was like losing a part of himself. For most people, that would be an immediate reason to pull out of the fight. But Shields still showed up. He still walked into the octagon. And you could see it. The moment he stepped in there, he wasn't the same. His face, his body language, the way he moved, it just looked off. And in the fight, it only took Jake Ellenberger 53 seconds to knock him out. 1 minute, Shields was fighting to keep his title hopes alive, The next, he was lying on the canvas, staring up at the lights with everything crashing down around him. And just like that, in less than a minute, the dream was gone. This was a turning point because for the first time in his UFC career, people weren't complaining about Shields being boring. They were talking about whether he even belonged in the UFC at all. The pressure intensified with each passing fight. But to his credit, Shields bounced back. Over the next few fights, he would win a decision over Yoshihiro Akiyama in a fight that was fine but nothing crazy. He had a grappling heavy fight against Ed Herman, which he actually won, but later got overturned to a no contest because of a failed drug test, as he popped for a diuretic. He would also fight Tyron Woodley in a super close fight, which again, he won by decision. Now, let's just pause here for a second, because that Tyron Woodley fight is important. At the time, Woodley wasn't the guy who would go on to become a UFC champion. But even back then, he was a dangerous, explosive fighter, the kind of guy that the UFC loved. And what did Shields do? He neutralized him. He shut down one of the most dangerous guys in the division. He didn't destroy him, he didn't finish him, but he still beat him. And you'd think the UFC would respect that, right? Well, no. Dana White responded by going off on how terrible the fight was, and the fans were not impressed either. At this point, Shields was still winning fights, and that should have kept him safe, right? Wrong, because now the UFC wasn't just looking at whether a guy was winning. They were asking, is this guy helping us sell tickets? And when Shields got booked against Demian Maia, that was basically the UFC saying, alright, let's see if this dude can actually be exciting. Now, if you love high-level grappling, this fight was amazing. It was one of the best pure jiu-jitsu battles in UFC history. Shields and Maia spent 5 full rounds scrambling, reversing positions, and showing off some of the most technical grappling ever seen in the octagon. But to the casual fans, it wasn't exciting enough. Shields won by split decision, but instead of celebrating a hard-fought victory, he found himself in an awkward position. Because despite beating a world-class grappler like Maia, his style was still a problem for the UFC. His next fight on March 15, 2014 was against Hector Lombard, a dangerous powerhouse who had the kind of knockout power that the UFC loved. And this time, Shields couldn't grind out a win. Lombard dominated him, and just 3 weeks later on April 6th, Shields was cut from the UFC. And here's the thing, he was still ranked 11th when they released him. Now let me say that again. The UFC fired a top 15 welterweight, not because he wasn't good enough, but because they didn't like his style. Now on the surface, the UFC claimed it was just a business decision, but let's be real. Shields got cut because he wasn't a knockout artist. He got cut because his fights didn't go viral. He got cut because he was winning the wrong way. And this was a wake-up call for the entire sport. Because if a guy like Jake Shields, who had beaten champions, won world titles, and shut down top contenders, could be cut just for not being entertaining enough, then what did that mean for other grapplers? What did it mean for guys who built their careers on elite wrestling and jiu-jitsu? And maybe the biggest question of all, had the UFC stopped being about finding the best fighters and started being about something else? Because after this, the UFC started putting more and more focus on exciting fighters even if they weren't actually the best. And as time went on, Shields' release started to look less like a business decision and more like the UFC making a statement. A statement that said, we don't just care about winning, we care about how you win. Jake got cut from the UFC. He had to be pissed off, because think about it, he was still ranked inside the top 15. He had just beaten Tyron Woodley and Demian Maia, 2 guys who would later fight for UFC gold. And he was still one of the best grapplers in the entire division. But none of that mattered, because in Dana White's eyes, Shields was bad for business. So where do you go when you're still elite, but the UFC doesn't want you anymore? Well, for Jake Shields, the answer was World Series of Fighting. And this is where things started getting weird. Because Shields would keep winning. He'd keep proving that he was still one of the best in the world. But now no one was paying attention. The situation made one thing crystal clear. The problem was never that Jake Shields wasn't good enough. The problem was that he was too good in a way the UFC didn't want. When Jake Shields signed with the World Series of Fighting in 2014, the promotion basically trying to be the next big thing to the UFC, but let's be honest, no one ever really saw it that way. But still, it was a solid landing spot. And in his debut, Shields did exactly what he always does. He ran through Ryan Ford in the first round, submitting him with a rear naked choke. When Shields started fighting outside of the UFC, he was actually finishing people again. Because in the UFC, he was fighting killers every single time. But in the WSOF, the talent gap was huge, so Shields looked like a monster again. And that set up a fight with John Fitch, another former UFC fighter, another grinder, another guy who the UFC cut because they thought he was boring. And if you were expecting a high-paced war, yeah, that didn't happen. Shields dominated early, but Fitch weathered the storm and came back to win by decision. And just like that, Shields had lost his first non-UFC fight in nearly a decade. But the crazy thing, he still wasn't done. Even after that, Shields bounced back and put together another streak of wins. He submitted Brian Foster, who was another solid veteran, and he outgrappled Danny Davis Jr. in another dominant performance. He was still proving that he belonged amongst the best. But here's the issue. It didn't matter anymore, because at this point, Shields was fighting in obscurity. He went from fighting in massive UFC pay-per-views to fighting in half-empty arenas where barely anyone was watching. And for a guy who had spent his whole career grinding for recognition, that had to be frustrating as hell. Because Shields wasn't just some washed-up fighter at this point. He was still really freaking good. And yet, no matter how many times he won, it felt like he was just stuck. He had been pushed out of the biggest stage, not because he wasn't talented, but because the UFC decided that his style wasn't marketable. Now you might be wondering, why didn't the UFC bring him back? Well, by this point, the UFC had completely changed how they did business. Back when Shields first signed, they were still focused on bringing in the best talent from around the world. But after his release, the UFC became way more selective about who they pushed. They wanted fighters with big personalities. They wanted guys who could sell pay-per-views. They wanted knockout artists, not grinders. Basically what they call the McGregor effect these days.
When you crossed over to mainstream celebrity, like what do you think is that? Your exciting style or other stuff you're doing, podcasts? Or
I do feel like it comes down to the knockouts. UFC gives you this platform, massive platform, and you go out there and knock someone out in spectacular fashion. UFC is going to use that.
Yeah.
And like the Eddie Wineland knockout was huge, the Thomas Almeida knockout, the Holly and Paiva, the Aljo. Like I feel like all the knockouts, the performances themselves kind of put me to that level.
And Shields was never going to be that guy. Plus, by this time, the UFC had enough big names at welterweight that they didn't need him anymore. They had guys like Robbie Lawler, Johnny Hendricks, Tyron Woodley, and Colby Covington. Shields was the exact opposite of what the UFC was looking for. So even though he kept winning, the call from the UFC never came again. By 2018, Shields had one last run left in him. At this point, the WSOF had rebranded into the PFL, the Professional Fighters League, and Shields saw it as one last shot at proving he was still elite. And he started strong, dominating Herman Tirado in his PFL debut. But after that, things started to slow down. In his next fight, he lost to Ray Cooper III, a dangerous young fighter who was just too explosive and too strong for him at this stage of his career. Shields fought him again in the playoffs and lost again. And just like that, his time as a top-level fighter was over. There was no farewell fight, no big send-off, no final moment in the spotlight. Jake Shields just faded away from the sport. And the craziest part, even though he was still good enough to compete, the industry had moved on without him. Even though he was still one of the most successful welterweights of his era, he ended up as a forgotten name. And that is what makes Jake Shields' career one of the biggest contradictions in MMA history. Because this guy should have been celebrated for his accomplishments. Instead, he was pushed aside, all because he didn't fight the way the UFC wanted him to. And that brings us to the next big question. Did the UFC make a mistake by cutting him? Or was Shields just a guy from the wrong era? Written off because he was too technical, too methodical, too boring, at least in the eyes of Dana White and the UFC brass. But here's the crazy part. The moment Shields was out, something wild started happening in the UFC. Because the guys who stuck around, they started fighting just like him. And instead of getting cut for it, they started winning championships. Think about it. When Shields was in the UFC, he was constantly criticized for his grappling-heavy control-based style. He doesn't do enough damage. He just holds guys down. He's not exciting. But right after he left, guess who became the most dominant fighters in the welterweight division? Guys with damn near the same style. Let's start with Kamaru Usman, a relentless wrestler who suffocated guys with control, pressure, and positional dominance. Usman ruled the welterweight division for years, defending his title 5 times and shutting down strikers left and right, the same way that Shields used to. And here's the kicker. When Usman fought Tyron Woodley for the belt, it looked just like Shields versus Woodley. Woodley got taken down, he got smothered, he got completely shut down. And the same people who called Shields boring, they were now calling Usman a dominant champion. It's almost like the UFC decided that this style was only a problem when Shields was the one using it. Now here's a question that nobody ever asked. If Shields hadn't been cut, could he have actually won the UFC title? Because look, he lost the GSP, sure, but who didn't? And let's not forget, Shields fought a 5-round war with GSP while being half blind and still did more damage than most of GSP's other challengers. So let's say that he does stick around. If he gets a shot at someone like Tyron Woodley, we already saw how that fight went, Shields won. And against guys like Robbie Lawler, well, we saw what happened when Shields fought Dan Henderson, a guy with even more power than Lawler. Shields got dropped, sure, but once he recovered, he absolutely dominated Hendo for 4 rounds straight. So if he fought Lawler, there's a good chance that Shields wins that fight too. And if that happens, if Shields wins the belt after GSP leaves, we're talking about him as a UFC champion, not an afterthought. But instead, he was forced to take the long road, and the UFC moved on without him. The wildest thing about Shields' career isn't that he was cut, it's who the UFC started pushing right after him. Because suddenly, being a dominant grappler wasn't a bad thing anymore. It was a championship formula. They pushed Khabib Nurmagomedov, a relentless pressure-based grappler, Islam Makhachev, a positional control machine, and Colby Covington, who straight up stole Shields' style, mixed it with trash talk, and became a UFC headliner. And the best part, when these guys fought, the UFC promoted them as elite technicians. But when Shields fought the same way, they called him boring and cut him loose. And that's what makes his story so frustrating, because if he had come a few years later, he might have been celebrated instead of ignored. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, okay, but does Shields actually belong in the conversation with the best welterweights ever? And honestly, yeah, he does, because let's look at the facts. Jake Shields went on a 15-fight win streak against some of the toughest guys in the sport. He beat Dan Henderson, Carlos Condit, Tyron Woodley, Damian Maia, Robbie Lawler, and countless other killers, all while holding titles in Strikeforce, Elite XC, and Rumble on the Rock, dominating every organization that he was in. And beyond the record, Shields proved that technical dominance can work at the highest level. He just happened to come at a time when the UFC wasn't ready to accept that. If there is one lesson to take from Jake Shields' story, it's this. MMA isn't just about who's the best fighter. It's about who the UFC wants to promote. And if you don't fit the mold, it doesn't matter how many guys you beat, the UFC will move on without you. So is cutting Jake Shields the UFC's biggest mistake? When you look at his resume, the champions he beat, the titles he won, and the legacy he left, it is hard to argue otherwise. The UFC cut a fighter this good, and that decision still doesn't make sense years later. But real fans, we remember, and that is why Jake Shields will always have a place in MMA history, whether the UFC likes it or not.